I shook the last drops from my water bottle, tasting warm metal and desperation on my cracked lips. The hollow sound when I rattled the empty container confirmed what my swollen tongue already knew. 4 days lost in the scrubland near Karroun Hill, and my lifeline had finally run dry. The morning sun was already brutal at 8 a.m., promising another scorching day that would push the mercury past 40 degrees. My hands trembled as I screwed the cap back onto the useless bottle, the simple motion requiring more concentration than it should. My mouth felt like I'd been chewing sandpaper for hours, and when I tried to swallow, there was nothing left to lubricate my throat. "Think, Jake, think." My voice came out as a rasp that startled me with its weakness. 4 days ago I'd been confident, maybe even cocky about this solo trek. Now, staring at the endless expanse of spinifex grass and scattered mallee scrub that stretched toward the ominous bulk of Karroun Hill, I could feel panic building in my chest, like a living thing. The hill loomed to my northeast, its rocky face catching the early light and throwing long shadows across the landscape. Local Aboriginal people had warned me about this country, but I'd dismissed their concerns as folklore. Standing stones dotted the lower slopes, arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, though erosion and time had left their original purpose unclear. Now those weathered sentinels looked less like curiosities and more like grave markers. I shouldered my pack, feeling how light it had become without the weight of water. My movement stirred a small dust devil that danced away across the red earth, mocking me with its effortless navigation. Every direction looked the same, an endless maze of low scrub punctuated by the occasional ghost gum. The landscape that had seemed beautifully harsh from my car window now felt indifferent, like it didn't care if I lived or died. My compass reading showed north, but I'd lost faith in my navigation skills completely. The terror of being truly lost, not temporarily misplaced, but genuinely, life-threateningly lost, settled into my bones like a fever. 5 days earlier, I'd been sitting in my Brisbane apartment, spreading topographical maps across my coffee table with the methodical precision of someone who believed planning could conquer anything. The route had looked straightforward enough: drive to the small township of Windora, park at the designated trailhead, and follow the marked track for a 3-day loop that would take me around the base of Karroun Hill before returning to my starting point. Simple enough for a weekend warrior, I'd muttered to myself, running my finger along the dotted line that represented the walking track. I'd completed dozens of shorter hikes around southeast Queensland, and my confidence had been building with each successful trip. This would be my first solo journey into genuine outback country, a test of my growing bush skills and a chance to prove I could handle more challenging terrain. The memory of Emma's face flashed through my mind, my 3-year-old daughter giggling as I showed her the maps, her small finger tracing the same route mine had followed. "Daddy going on adventure," she'd said in that matter-of-fact way children have, and I'd promised her I'd bring back stories, and maybe some interesting rocks. The thought of never seeing her again made my chest tighten, with something worse than thirst. The drive west had taken most of Friday, Queensland's green coast, giving way to the rust-colored heart of the continent. By the time I'd reached Windora, the sun was setting behind me, painting the sky in shades that no city dweller could fully appreciate. I'd camped that night at the official site, sharing beers and stories with an elderly couple from Adelaide, who were traveling in a well-equipped motorhome. "You sure about going out there alone, love?" the woman had asked, her weathered face creased with genuine concern. "That's harsh country, especially this time of year." I'd waved off her worries with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced genuine danger. "I've got GPS, satellite phone, plenty of water. Besides, it's only 3 days on a marked track." The couple had exchanged glances, and the husband had leaned forward with the serious expression of someone who'd earned his wisdom the hard way. "Been out here 40 years and I've seen that country humble plenty of people who thought they had it figured out. Karroun Hill's got a reputation, mate. Aboriginal folks won't even camp near it after dark." But I'd been riding high on my own competence, my pack organized with military precision, my gear carefully chosen and tested. I'd even studied the traditional ownership maps, knowing this was Kalila country, though I'd given little thought to what that actually meant beyond respecting sacred sites marked on my maps. Saturday morning had dawned clear and perfect, the kind of day that makes the outback seem like paradise rather than purgatory. I'd started early, following what appeared to be a well-defined track that wound through open woodland before gradually climbing toward the escarpment country around Karroun Hill. The first sign of trouble had come around noon on that first day, when I realized the track seemed to be veering further east than my map indicated. I'd stopped to check my GPS, frowning at the reading that showed me several degrees off course. The device must be slightly off, I'd reasoned. After all, there was clearly a path to follow, worn by countless boots, and probably updated since my maps were printed. That decision, to trust the visible track over my instruments, had been the first link in a chain of small errors that led to disaster. By afternoon, the path had become fainter, sometimes disappearing entirely among granite boulder fields before resuming on the far side. I'd pressed on, convinced that I was simply crossing more challenging terrain and that the track would become clearer once I reached more open country. As the sun began to set on Saturday, I'd started looking for a suitable campsite, expecting to find designated areas marked with fire rings or cleared patches. Instead, the country grew rougher and more broken, forcing me to eventually make camp in a small clearing between two large boulders. The site provided wind protection but felt somehow wrong, too isolated and quiet, like I was camping in a place where humans weren't meant to sleep. Sunday had brought the sickening realization that I was genuinely lost. The track I'd been following simply vanished, terminating at a rockfall that showed no signs of recent passage. I'd spent that morning retracing my steps, growing increasingly frantic as I failed to relocate the path that had led me astray. My GPS showed me as being nearly 10 kilometers southeast of where I should be, in country that appeared blank on my topographical maps. The landscape here was more rugged than anything I'd expected, carved by ancient watercourses into a maze of gullies and ridges that all looked identical from ground level. Karroun Hill dominated the northwestern horizon, but using it as a landmark only confirmed how far off course I'd strayed. I'd tried my satellite phone repeatedly, but the rocky terrain seemed to block the signal, leaving me cut off from any hope of calling for help. By Monday morning, now 4 days ago, I'd been rationing my water and trying to think systematically about survival priorities. I'd struck out toward the northwest, reasoning that I needed to reach more open country where my phone might work and where I'd have a better chance of being spotted by aircraft. But the broken terrain forced me into meandering detours that ate up time and energy while making little real progress. Now, staring at my empty water bottle, I understood how completely I'd underestimated this country. My careful planning meant nothing when it was based on being somewhere else entirely. Water had to be my first priority now that my bottles were empty. I tried to recall everything I'd ever read about finding water in arid country. Though most of my hiking experience had been in coastal ranges where streams and springs were common, here the landscape looked like it hadn't seen significant rainfall in months, maybe years. I started by following a dry creek bed that wound between low hills, reasoning that even intermittent watercourses sometimes held pools in their deeper sections. The walking was easier on the sandy bottom, and I felt a flicker of optimism as I imagined finding a hidden spring, or at least some damp sand I could dig into. My boots crunched on the dried mud that had cracked into geometric patterns, each step sending up small puffs of dust that settled on my already grimy pants. After 2 hours of following the creek's meandering course, I'd found nothing but increasingly dry sand and the bleached bones of some long-dead animal. The ribs curved up from the creek bed, like the hull of a wrecked boat, picked clean by scavengers and polished smooth by wind. The watercourse eventually petered out entirely in a flat area, where the sand was cracked into geometric patterns by heat and drought. No amount of digging with my bare hands revealed even a hint of moisture, just more sand that ran through my fingers like an hourglass measuring time I didn't have. My next strategy was to look for the greenest vegetation, thinking that trees and shrubs might indicate underground water. I climbed painfully out of the creek bed, my legs already feeling shaky from dehydration, and surveyed the surrounding country. Eventually I spotted a line of slightly taller trees that might mark another watercourse. The detour took me further from my intended direction, but water trumped navigation at this point. The trees turned out to be growing along another dry creek, this one even more barren than the first. I spent precious energy exploring up and down its length, checking every depression and overhang where water might collect during rare rains. The afternoon heat was building, turning the creek bed into an oven that reflected waves of shimmering air. I found only dust and the tracks of small animals that had passed this way during the night, probably searching for the same water I desperately needed. As the day wore on and my mouth grew more parched, I began looking for any sign of moisture. I examined the undersides of rocks, hoping for condensation or seepage, finding only more dust and the occasional spider that scuttled away from my intrusion. I dug small holes in low-lying areas where rain might have collected, my fingernails splitting and bleeding as they scraped against stones. I even tried chewing on succulent-looking plants, spitting them out quickly when they proved bitter with alkaloids that made my tongue burn. By afternoon, my initial optimism was giving way to something much darker. The landscape seemed actively hostile, designed to hide any trace of water from desperate travelers. Every promising depression turned out to be bone-dry. Every patch of greener vegetation was revealed as simply hardier desert plants that survived on moisture so sparse I couldn't detect it. My attempts at finding shelter were only marginally more successful. The country offered plenty of rocks and overhangs that would provide shade, but most were too small for a man to lie down comfortably, or positioned where they'd become ovens once the sun moved overhead. I eventually settled on a spot between two large granite boulders that would give me shade from mid-morning until late afternoon, though it meant spending the dawn hours in full sun. The shelter felt cramped and somehow menacing. Strange stains on the rock surfaces might have been mineral deposits, or the remains of Aboriginal paintings, weathered beyond recognition by countless seasons. I found myself studying these marks obsessively, trying to read meaning into random patterns that could have been warnings or maps, or just the result of water running down stone for thousands of years. As I sat in my inadequate shelter, rationing the few remaining drops of water I'd managed to conserve from the dregs of all my bottles, the psychological pressure began building like storm clouds on a clear horizon. The silence was the worst part. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest, but the oppressive hush of a landscape where nothing moved except the occasional dust devil. I'd started talking to myself on the second day, initially just muttering observations or complaints about the heat and the terrain. Now, with real desperation setting in, I found myself conducting entire conversations with imaginary companions. I argued with my ex-wife Sarah about my decision to hike alone, explaining my situation to my mother, trying out different versions of how I'd tell the story when I got home, always when, never if. The key is not to panic, I told an invisible search and rescue coordinator, practicing the calm demeanor I'd adopt when the helicopter finally spotted me. I made some navigation errors, but I've got basic survival skills, just need to stay hydrated and keep moving toward open country. But even as I spoke these reasonable words aloud, I could hear the tremor in my voice. My hands shook when I wasn't paying attention to them, and I'd caught myself staring into space for long periods, my mind simply shutting down rather than processing the magnitude of my situation. The worst part was the nights. As soon as the sun disappeared behind the western ridgelines, the temperature would plummet, leaving me shivering in my sleeping bag while strange sounds echoed across the landscape. Most were probably just the normal noises of desert animals, the distant call of a dingo, the scrabbling of small creatures among the rocks, the whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation. But some sounds seemed to come from Karroun Hill itself, carrying clearly across the kilometers that separated me from its bulk. Low moans that might have been whined through rock formations, or something else entirely. Sharp cracks like gunshots that could have been stone splitting in the temperature change, or footsteps on loose scree. And sometimes, strangest of all, what sounded almost like voices, not quite human, not quite animal, speaking in a language I couldn't identify. During my third night, I'd been certain I could see lights moving on the distant slopes of Karroun Hill. Not the steady glow of human habitation, but flickering points of illumination that appeared and disappeared without pattern. I'd watched them for hours, my sleeping bag pulled tight around my shoulders, trying to decide whether to attempt the dangerous night journey toward what might be other people, or whether the lights were simply hallucinations brought on by stress and dehydration. By morning, I'd convinced myself the lights were real, though I couldn't explain them rationally. Mining activity, perhaps, though my maps showed no current operations in the area. Aboriginal ceremonial fires, though that seemed unlikely in country the traditional owners reportedly avoided. Or something else entirely, something that belonged to this harsh landscape in ways I was only beginning to understand. Now, on my fifth morning, with my water gone and the sun climbing toward another punishing day, I knew my margin for error had disappeared entirely. Every decision from this point forward would be potentially fatal. The psychological pressure was becoming physical. My heart raced even when I was sitting still, and dark spots danced at the edges of my vision when I stood up too quickly. The country that had seemed merely challenging 4 days ago now felt like an adversary with intelligence and malice, testing my resolve at every step. And somewhere to the northwest, Karroun Hill continued its ancient watch over travelers who had ventured too far into the red heart of a continent that had never been fully tamed. My body's relationship with water is measured in hours, not days, and by my 6th morning I could feel every cell screaming its protest. My tongue had swollen to fill my mouth like a foreign object, thick and unresponsive, making speech nearly impossible. The simple act of swallowing had become a conscious effort that sent sharp pains down my throat, each attempt feeling like I was trying to force sand through a narrow tube. The headaches that had been intermittent were now constant, a dull pounding that seemed synchronized with my pulse and grew worse whenever I moved my head too quickly. When I tried to stand, the world tilted sideways like I was on the deck of a rolling ship. I had to grab at the nearest rock for support, while my vision tunneled to a narrow corridor of harsh sunlight surrounded by creeping darkness. My legs trembled with the effort of supporting my weight, muscles that had carried me through dozens of hikes now struggling with the basic mechanics of standing upright. I had found no water, despite 2 full days of increasingly desperate searching. The creek bed I'd followed for 6 kilometers had been bone dry, its sandy bottom cracked into geometric patterns that seemed to mock my thirst. Rock pools that had appeared promising from a distance turned out to be shallow depressions filled with nothing but dust and the brittle shells of long-dead insects, their wings transparent as paper in the harsh light. Even the sparse vegetation offered no relief. The desert plants hoarded their moisture too jealously to share with a dying man, their waxy leaves designed to prevent exactly the kind of water loss that was killing me. My initial strategy of moving during the cooler hours and resting in shade during the heat of the day had collapsed into a frantic, irrational pursuit of any feature that might conceal water. I found myself climbing impossible slopes toward shadows that might indicate caves, my boots slipping on loose scree as I scrambled, toward hope that evaporated like mirages. I stumbled across broken ground toward stands of trees that proved to be heat distortions, following animal tracks that led nowhere except deeper into the maze of red rock and spinifex. My methodical approach to navigation had devolved into desperate wandering, guided more by hope than logic, my compass hanging unused from its lanyard while I chased phantoms across the burning landscape. The psychological impact was almost worse than the physical deterioration. I'd always prided myself on being rational under pressure, someone who could think through problems systematically and find practical solutions. But now I caught myself making bargains with rocks and trees, pleading with a landscape that couldn't hear me as if it were a conscious entity capable of mercy. "Come on," I'd whisper to a depression in the rock that looked like it might hold water, "just give me something, just a few drops." When the depression proved dry, I'd feel personally betrayed, as if the desert had deliberately deceived me. I found myself talking aloud constantly, narrating my actions in a running commentary that helped fill the terrible silence that pressed against my eardrums like physical weight. Checking this outcrop now, might be seepage underneath. No, nothing here either. Need to try the eastern face, get out of this wind. My voice had become a harsh whisper that barely qualified as sound, but I couldn't stop. The alternative, accepting the absolute silence of the desert, felt like surrendering to something fundamental. As long as I kept talking, some essential part of myself remained connected to the world of human communication, even if I was the only one listening. The nights were becoming unbearable in ways that went beyond mere discomfort. My sleeping bag provided little comfort when my body had lost the ability to regulate temperature properly. I would shiver uncontrollably for hours, my teeth chattering so hard I was afraid they might crack, then suddenly find myself drenched in sweat despite the cold desert air that made my breath visible in the starlight. And always, the sounds from Karroun Hill continued their mysterious chorus, the groaning that might have been wind through hidden canyons, the sharp cracks that could have been falling stone or something moving across the scree slopes, and underneath it all, those almost voices that seemed to be calling my name in the darkness. By the 7th day, my decision-making process had narrowed to a single criterion: where might there be water? Everything else, shelter, navigation, the growing distance from my planned route, became secondary to the consuming need for liquid. My mouth had stopped producing saliva entirely, and my lips had cracked so deeply that they bled when I tried to open them. The blood tasted metallic and wrong, but it was moisture, and I found myself licking at it desperately. I began to take risks that my rational mind recognized as potentially fatal, but which my dehydrated brain justified as necessary chances. The worst decision came when I spotted what appeared to be a green line across a valley floor, vegetation that might indicate a running stream or at least a seasonal watercourse with some remaining pools. Reaching it required descending a steep scree slope that would be difficult to climb back up if the water proved to be another mirage. The loose stone shifted under every step, creating small avalanches that could easily turn into a catastrophic fall that would leave me broken and helpless at the bottom. I didn't hesitate. I half ran, half fell down the slope, my pack throwing me off balance as I fought to stay upright. Rocks the size of dinner plates rolled ahead of me, gathering smaller stones in growing avalanches that filled the air with dust. I was focused entirely on the promise of green vegetation below, my mind refusing to consider the consequences of what I was doing. The green line was real vegetation, but it grew from sand so dry it ran through my fingers like powder when I grabbed handfuls and squeezed, hoping to extract even a few drops of moisture. The plant survived on some deep water table completely inaccessible to human effort, their roots probably extending down dozens of meters to tap into fossil water laid down thousands of years ago. I spent hours digging with my bare hands, creating holes that immediately filled with loose sand no matter how fast I worked. My fingernails cracked and bled, mixing red dust with red blood until I couldn't distinguish between them, my torn fingers leaving bloody prints on every rock I touched. The holes I dug grew deeper and more desperate as the day wore on. I'd clear out armfuls of sand only to watch it slide back down the sides, erasing my work in seconds. The deepest hole I managed was perhaps 2 meters across and nearly a meter deep, before I finally accepted that I was wasting precious energy on an impossible task. At the bottom, the sand was no damper than at the surface. Just more sand, more dust, more proof that the water I needed was beyond my reach. Climbing back up the scree slope took everything I had left. For every 2 steps upward, the loose stone would slide me 1 step back, an endless cycle of progress and retreat that left me gasping with exhaustion. My legs trembled with each step, and several times I had to stop and close my eyes while waves of dizziness passed through me like ocean swells. When I finally reached the top, I lay gasping in the thin shade of a boulder, too weak to continue but too terrified to rest for long. The 8th day brought a new symptom that terrified me more than the physical deterioration, visual distortions that went beyond simple hallucinations. The landscape itself seemed to be shifting, with distances becoming elastic and colors bleeding into spectrums that didn't exist in normal vision. A cliff face would appear close enough to touch, and I'd walk toward it for an hour without getting measurably closer. The rocks seeming to recede like images in a funhouse mirror. Shadows would move independently of their sources, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric shapes that my brain couldn't process properly. It was during one of these episodes that I saw the lights in daylight for the first time. Not the mysterious flickering I'd observed on Karroun Hill during the nights, but points of brilliant illumination that seemed to dance just at the edge of my peripheral vision, like angels made of pure light. When I turned my head to look directly at them, they would vanish, only to reappear somewhere else the moment I looked away. They moved with purpose, always staying just far enough ahead to draw me forward, but never close enough for me to be certain they were real. At first, I tried to convince myself these were symptoms of severe dehydration, which they almost certainly were, but the lights had a quality that seemed too purposeful to be mere neurological misfiring. They appeared to be leading me in a specific direction, herding me like a sheepdog herding livestock, always toward the northwest, where Karroun Hill dominated the horizon. I'd seen enough survival shows to know that following hallucinations was often the last mistake dying people made, but what alternative did I have? "I'm losing my mind," I whispered to the empty air, my voice barely audible even to myself, the words scraping my throat like sandpaper. "This is what happens. This is how people die out here. They see things that aren't there and follow them off cliffs." But even as I spoke the words, I found myself following the lights anyway. What choice did I have? My own navigation had failed completely, leaving me wandering in circles through country that showed no signs of human presence. I was lost in the most fundamental way possible, with no water and no realistic prospect of rescue. If hallucinations wanted to lead me somewhere, at least it was movement with a purpose, even if that purpose existed only in my dying brain. The lights led me toward Karroun Hill, just as I'd somehow known they would. I'd been unconsciously avoiding the hill since the first night, when its bulk had seemed more ominous than promising, like a sleeping giant that might wake if disturbed. Now, stumbling across broken ground with my vision fragmenting into kaleidoscope patterns, I realized the lights were drawing me directly toward its lower slopes. The distance that had seemed manageable on my first day now felt enormous, kilometers of rough terrain that would have to be crossed by a man whose body was beginning to shut down from dehydration. I made it perhaps 300 meters before my legs simply gave out. The fall wasn't dramatic. no stumbling or crying out. My legs simply stopped supporting my weight, and I folded forward onto my hands and knees like a puppet with cut strings, then sideways into the sparse shade of a desert oak. For several minutes, I simply lay there, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs, while my vision pulsed between clarity and darkness, in rhythm with my pulse. This was it, I realized with crystalline clarity. This was where it ended. 8 days of struggle, and I would die within sight of the hill that had been watching my slow decline since the beginning. The thought should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me like cool water. The constant pressure of survival decisions could finally end. No more desperate searches for water that didn't exist. No more rationing energy I didn't have. No more forcing my protesting body across terrain that seemed designed to kill travelers like me. I could close my eyes and let the desert reclaim another foolish city dweller who had ventured too far from safety. But as my vision darkened and my breathing began to slow, I found myself thinking about Emma, barely 3 years old, who would grow up with only vague memories of a father who had disappeared in the red center of Australia. Her face appeared in my mind with startling clarity, bright brown eyes that sparkled with mischief, the gap between her front teeth that made her lisp when she said, "Daddy," the way she would run to the door when I came home from work each evening. She would ask questions Sarah couldn't answer. Why did Daddy go alone? Why didn't he turn back when he got lost? Why wasn't coming home to his family more important than proving something to himself in country that didn't care whether he lived or died? How many days before that question would stop being asked? How many years before my face became just a photograph on her dresser instead of a living memory? The image of Emma's face, bright with the uncomplicated trust that only children possessed, hit me with enough force to open my eyes. She would be waiting for me to return from my hiking trip, probably asking her mother every day when Daddy was coming home. I couldn't let her grow up thinking her father had abandoned her to chase some meaningless adventure in the desert. I forced myself to sit up, fighting through the dizziness that immediately threatened to knock me flat again. My body was failing, shutting down system by system, but some fundamental part of my identity refused to surrender. I was Emma's father. I was a man who solved problems for a living, who had navigated difficult terrain before, who had survived other challenges through persistence and rational thinking. This desert wanted to kill me, but it would have to work harder than this. Standing up required 3 attempts and left me swaying like a drunk, but I managed it. The lights, hallucination or otherwise, were still visible in my peripheral vision, still pointing toward Karroun Hill like ghostly fingers. If my rational mind couldn't find a solution, maybe I would have to trust whatever remained of my instincts. Indigenous people had survived in this country for tens of thousands of years. Water existed here somewhere, hidden, but accessible to those who knew how to look. The walk toward Karroun Hill became a meditation on movement itself. I broke the distance down into the smallest possible increments, the next boulder, the next patch of shade, the next flat section, where I could rest without falling over. I stopped measuring time or distance, focusing entirely on the mechanics of putting one foot in front of the other, while my body screamed protests I couldn't afford to acknowledge. Each step required conscious effort, a deliberate decision to keep moving when every cell in my body was begging me to lie down and accept defeat. By evening, the hill's lower slopes were close enough to touch. The ancient rock face rose above me like a cathedral wall, its surface carved into fantastic shapes by millions of years of wind and weather. In the failing light, the formations looked almost architectural, doorways and windows and staircases leading to chambers that existed only in stone dreams. I could understand why the local Aboriginal people considered this country sacred. It possessed a presence that went beyond simple geological formation, a sense of ancient awareness that made me feel like an intruder in something's domain. The strange sounds were louder here, no longer distant echoes but immediate presence that seemed to come from the rock itself. The wind through the rock formations created harmonics that sounded almost musical, as if the hill itself was humming in frequencies just below human hearing. And underneath the windsong, I could swear I heard something that sounded like water, not the rush of a stream, but the steady drip of liquid falling into pools hidden somewhere in the hill's interior. My rational mind tried to dismiss the sound as wishful thinking, the audio equivalent of a mirage. But my body was already moving toward it, following acoustic clues that seemed to bypass conscious thought entirely. I climbed with my eyes closed, letting my ears guide me toward the sound that might mean salvation, or might be the final hallucination of a dying brain. The trail I followed was barely visible, worn smooth by countless feet, animal or human, I couldn't tell. It led upward along the hill's face, winding between rock formations that provided blessed relief from the wind that had been constant for days. My boots found purchase on stone, worn smooth as glass, and I had to use my hands for balance as the path climbed steadily higher above the desert floor. The trail led to a natural terrace about 50 meters above the desert floor, sheltered by overhanging rock and invisible from below. And there, carved into the living stone by geological processes I couldn't begin to understand, was a pool of water so clear it seemed like a mirror reflecting stars that hadn't yet appeared in the sky above. I stared at the pool for a long time, afraid to move closer in case it proved to be another cruel mirage. The water was real. I could hear it dripping from somewhere higher up the cliff face, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. I could smell the mineral scent of moisture in air that had been dry for days, could see insects hovering over the surface in clouds that spoke of genuine, life-giving water. But after 8 days of disappointment, my mind refused to accept what my senses were reporting. Finally, moving with the careful deliberation of someone defusing a bomb, I approached the pool and knelt beside its edge. The water was cold when I cupped it in my trembling hands, cold and real, and life itself flowing between my fingers. I brought it to my lips with infinite care, half expecting it to evaporate at the last second. When the water touched my tongue, I nearly wept with relief. It was real, mineral-rich and slightly alkaline, tasting of stone and thyme, but to me, it might as well have been the finest wine ever bottled. I drank carefully at first, small sips that my shrunken stomach could handle, then with increasing desperation as my body recognized salvation and demanded more. Each mouthful sent signals of relief through my nervous system, like electricity through wires. I could feel my body beginning the slow process of returning from the edge of shutdown, my heart rate gradually slowing from its panicked racing, the crushing headache starting to recede, my vision beginning to clear for the first time in days. But survival was only the first step. I was still lost, still alone, and still facing the challenge of finding my way back to civilization. The water had bought me time, but Karroun Hill was keeping its own counsel about whether that time would be enough. I spent the rest of that day at the hidden pool, drinking slowly and methodically while my body absorbed the life-giving water like a sponge. The pool was perhaps 3 meters across and deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom in its center, fed by a steady drip from somewhere in the cliff face above. The water tasted ancient, as if it had been filtering through rock for thousands of years before emerging here. As my dehydration symptoms began to ease, my mind cleared enough to realize that finding water was only half the battle. The pool was a godsend, but it was also isolated, tucked away in a fold of rock that no search party would ever discover by accident. I could survive here indefinitely, but survival without rescue was just a slower form of dying, a way to postpone the inevitable, while my family spent the rest of their lives wondering what had happened to me. On my 10th morning lost, I forced myself to leave the sanctuary of the pool. I filled my empty bottles with the precious water, drinking as much as I could hold, before beginning the treacherous climb higher up Karroun Hill. I needed a vantage point that might reveal some sign of human presence, a road, a fence line, even vehicle tracks that could guide me back toward civilization. The climb was treacherous, made worse by my physical weakness despite the water I'd consumed. My body had been pushed too far for complete recovery in a single day, and I still felt shaky and unsteady on the loose rock. The terrain changed as I gained altitude, red sandstone giving way to darker rock that was harder but more fractured. The sparse vegetation became even more scattered until I was climbing through landscapes that seemed more lunar than terrestrial. My boots slipped constantly on loose scree, sending small avalanches cascading down the slope behind me. Twice I had to backtrack when cliff faces proved impassable, and once I found myself clinging to a narrow ledge while rocks I'd dislodged fell away into darkness below. The sun hammered down without mercy, and despite the water I'd consumed, my body continued to show signs of severe stress. My hands shook constantly now, fine tremors that made precise movements difficult, and dark spots danced at the edges of my vision whenever I stood too quickly or looked up at the bright sky. It was near midday when I crested a ridge and saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Below me, in a natural depression that formed a hidden valley within the hill's embrace, lay the scattered remains of what had once been a substantial human operation. Rusted machinery, collapsed buildings, and the geometric patterns of human engineering stood out starkly against the organic chaos of the landscape. I stared at the sight for several minutes, hardly daring to believe it was real and not another hallucination brought on by stress and dehydration. But the ruins were solid and three-dimensional, casting shadows that moved properly as clouds passed overhead. Metal glinted in the sunlight, where corrugated iron sheets had been twisted by wind and time, but still reflected the harsh Australian sun. The descent into the valley took another hour of careful climbing. As I drew closer to the ruins, details emerged that told the story of the place. This had been a mining camp, probably dating back decades judging by the style of the equipment and buildings. Weathered signs warned of dangerous shafts and unstable structures, their paint faded, but still legible after years of exposure. Most of the buildings had collapsed or been reduced to concrete foundations scattered with twisted metal and broken glass, but a few corrugated iron structures still stood, their walls pocked with rust holes that let in shafts of sunlight. My heart sank as I explored the ruins more thoroughly. Everything useful had been removed long ago, and what remained was too corroded or damaged to be of any help. Broken machinery lay scattered among the foundations, like the bones of prehistoric animals, stripped of anything valuable and left to rust in the desert air. My hopes of finding supplies or communication equipment evaporated as I picked through the debris, finding nothing but twisted metal and shattered glass. But then, as I rounded the corner of what might have been an office building, my ears caught something that stopped me cold. The sound was rhythmic and mechanical, a slow grinding pulse that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the complex, like the heartbeat of some ancient machine that refused to die. I followed the sound with growing excitement, my pulse quickening, as I realized what it might mean. Behind a stand of twisted metal that had once been a conveyor system, I found the source, a bore pump, ancient and corroded, but still somehow functioning. The pump was a marvel of mechanical persistence, its engine housing more rust than metal, held together by wire and what looked like pure stubborn will, but it was running, coughing and struggling with each cycle, but still drawing power from some hidden source. The engine made sounds that no healthy machine should make, grinding, wheezing, rattling like a dying animal, but it was working. The pump was connected to a borehole that disappeared into the earth like a dark eye, and from its outlet came a thin but steady trickle of water. I knelt beside the flow and tasted it cautiously. It was warm and mineral-heavy, with a metallic tang that spoke of its journey through iron-rich rock far below the surface, but it was water. More importantly, it was accessible water. I wouldn't need to climb back to the hidden pool every time my bottles ran dry. But even as relief washed through me like a cool breeze, I realized I was facing new problems. The pump was clearly on its last legs, coughing and struggling more with each cycle, its ancient engine held together by hope and mechanical memory. The water flow was decreasing even as I watched, and the ominous grinding sound suggested that the machinery might not last much longer. Worse, the fuel tank that powered the engine was nearly empty, its gauge showing only the thinnest sliver of diesel remaining at the bottom. I spent the rest of that day exploring the mining camp more thoroughly, searching for anything that might help extend the pump's operation or improve my situation. In the ruins of what had been a maintenance shed, I found a few tools and spare parts scattered among the debris. Most were too corroded to be useful, their metal eaten away by decades of exposure, but some were still serviceable, a wrench that might fit the pump's fittings, wire that could be used for repairs, even a small funnel that would help with precise work. More importantly, I discovered several jerry cans that had once held fuel. They were empty now, bone dry and smelling faintly of diesel from decades past, but their presence suggested there might be more fuel somewhere in the complex. I began a systematic search of every structure, every hiding place, where fuel might have been stored against future need. My search was interrupted by the pump's engine, coughing to a stop with a finality that sent ice through my veins. In the sudden silence that followed, I felt panic rise in my throat like bile. I rushed back to the bore and found the pump sitting idle, its fuel tank finally exhausted, the needle resting on empty with the absolute certainty of death. The trickle of water had stopped completely, leaving only damp stains on the concrete pad as evidence it had ever flowed. Working by the light of my phone's dying battery, I attempted to restart the engine with the desperate intensity of someone performing CPR on a loved one. The fuel line still held enough diesel for a few more minutes of operation, trapped in the tubes and filters by surface tension and mechanical inertia. After 20 minutes of cursing and mechanical persuasion, pumping primers and adjusting chokes with shaking hands, I managed to coax the engine back to life. Water began flowing again, but at an even more reduced rate than before, barely a trickle compared to the steady stream I'd found earlier. I filled my bottles quickly, working with the efficiency of someone who knew this might be the last time, then switched the engine off to conserve what little fuel remained. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, weighted with the knowledge that I was living on borrowed time measured in minutes of diesel fuel. The next morning brought my 11th day of being lost, and with it, a stark realization of my true situation. I had water, but only if I could keep the ancient pump running on vapor and mechanical stubbornness. I had shelter among the ruins, better protection from the elements than I'd found in the open desert, but no way to signal for help, and no clear idea of which direction might lead back to civilization. The mining camp felt like a trap, better than dying of thirst in the open desert, but still a prison of rusted metal and false hope. My physical condition continued to deteriorate despite my access to water. The stress of my ordeal, combined with lack of proper food and sleep, had taken a severe toll that water alone couldn't reverse. My clothes hung loose on my frame, and I could feel my ribs clearly through my shirt when I pressed against my chest. Every movement required conscious effort, and my hands trembled constantly with fine tremors that made detailed work nearly impossible. Sometimes I caught myself talking to imaginary companions, carrying on conversations with rescue workers who existed only in my increasingly unstable mind. Found this old mining camp. I'd explain to invisible helicopters circling overhead. Pump still working, just need to keep it running until you get here. The conversations felt real enough that I'd look up expecting to see aircraft, finding only empty sky that mocked my desperation. On my 11th day lost, while searching through the ruins of what appeared to have been the camp's communications building, I made a discovery that made my heart race with something approaching hope. Scattered among the debris of collapsed shelving and water-damaged equipment, I found the remains of a radio installation. Most of the equipment was long dead, corroded beyond any hope of repair by decades of exposure to moisture and temperature extremes. Vacuum tubes had shattered, wiring had deteriorated into green powder, and metal housings had rusted through completely. But the antenna mast still stood, swaying slightly in the desert wind but fundamentally sound, and more importantly, the installation included a backup power system. Solar panels that, while old and partially damaged, were still capable of generating electricity. The radio itself was useless, its circuits destroyed by time and weather, but I realized that the solar array might provide the power I needed to charge my phone and perhaps send a signal. The panels were covered in years of accumulated dust, and some had cracked glass that spiderwebbed across their surfaces, but when I cleaned them with water from my precious bottles and checked the connections with my fingers, I found that several were still functional. The battery bank that had originally stored their power was another matter entirely. Acid corroded and clearly dead for years, its cases split open to reveal crystallized battery acid that had eaten through the metal housing. But my phone had its own battery, and if I could rig a connection between the solar panels and my device, I might be able to get enough power to make a call or send a message that could bring help. The work required careful electrical connections using whatever wire and components I could salvage from the ruins, and my hands shook so badly that each connection took multiple attempts. I had to strip insulation with my teeth when I couldn't find proper tools, and I shocked myself several times on poorly insulated connections. But gradually, using skills I'd half forgotten from high school electronics classes, I began to assemble a crude but functional charging system. As I worked, the ancient pump continued its irregular operation, coughing to life whenever I managed to coax a few more drops of fuel from the system, through increasingly desperate measures. I had become expert at maximizing every precious minute of operation, timing my water collection to coincide with the pump's brief periods of function. The jerry cans I'd found had yielded a few more liters of decades-old diesel, when I'd turned them upside down and waited for gravity to collect every possible drop, enough to keep the pump running for perhaps another day or two if I was extremely careful. The jury-rigged solar charging system took me most of my 11th day to complete, working with the methodical patience of someone who knew that making mistakes could mean death. Even when I thought I'd finished, I wasn't sure it would work. The connections were crude, held together with wire I'd stripped from other equipment, and the voltage output was inconsistent, depending on cloud cover and the angle of the sun. But as the afternoon sun hit the cleaned panels at the optimal angle, painting them gold in the slanted light, my phone showed the charging symbol I'd been hoping for. It was weak, barely enough to maintain the battery level, let alone increase it significantly, but it was power flowing into my device for the first time in days. I positioned my phone carefully to capture the maximum signal strength I could find, moving it around the ruins until I found a spot where the bars flickered between 0 and 1. The signal was inconsistent, fading in and out like a radio station at the edge of its range, but it was there. As the sun tracked across the sky, and my improvised solar array fed power to my phone, I watched my battery percentage climb with agonizing slowness. 23%, 24, 25. Each percentage point felt like a victory against the forces that were trying to kill me. The 12th day dawned with my phone showing 37% battery, the highest it had been since my first day lost. More importantly, when I climbed to the highest accessible point in the ruins and held my phone toward the eastern horizon, I saw something that made my pulse race, a single bar of signal strength, flickering and unstable but definitely there. My hands shook as I attempted to place a call, but the connection was too weak and intermittent to maintain voice communication. The call would connect for a few seconds, then drop, leaving me staring at a screen that showed, "Call failed," with the mechanical indifference of technology. Text messages offered a better chance, requiring less bandwidth and able to queue for transmission when signal conditions improved. With careful precision, treating each character like it might be the difference between life and death, I typed out a message containing my situation and approximate location. Lost 12 days near Karroun Hill, found old mining camp, need rescue, battery dying. I added GPS coordinates from my phone and hit send, watching as my device attempted to push the message through the tenuous connection to the outside world. The message failed to send immediately, showing a small exclamation point that indicated it was queued for retry. But my phone continued trying automatically, retransmitting whenever it detected the slightest improvement in signal strength. I sent several more messages to different contacts, Sarah, my parents, emergency services, hoping that at least one might get through the electronic maze that separated me from help. Then, positioning my phone in the spot where I'd detected the strongest signal, I settled in to wait and conserve my remaining strength. The morning sun was already building toward another scorching day, but for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, I felt something approaching hope. The pump finally died completely on the morning of my 12th day, its ancient engine seizing with a grinding finality that echoed across the valley like a death rattle. I'd been expecting this moment for days, listening to the engine's complaints growing more severe with each cycle, but it still hit me like a physical blow. The sudden silence felt enormous after days of the pump's rhythmic gasping, and I realized how much comfort I'd taken from its mechanical persistence. Without the pump, I was back to rationing whatever water I could collect in my bottles, and the hidden pool was hours of climbing away through terrain I wasn't sure I could still navigate in my weakened state. My legs felt like they were made of glass, ready to shatter at any moment, and my vision still flickered with dark spots whenever I moved too quickly. But then, as I sat beside the silent pump and contemplated my dwindling options, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The sound was so unexpected that I thought it was another hallucination at first, but the screen was definitely showing an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. The signal was weak and the connection poor, crackling with static, but I could make out enough words to understand that my messages had gotten through. Search and rescue, mobilizing teams, GPS coordinates. Hold on. The voice faded in and out like a distant radio station, but it was real, human, proof that the world beyond Karroun Hill still existed and was trying to reach me. Search and rescue teams were being mobilized, and GPS coordinates from my phone were guiding them toward my location in the hidden valley. The rescue itself came not from the air, as I'd always imagined, but from the ground. A 4-wheel drive vehicle appeared on a ridge above the mining camp just after noon on my 12th day, its occupants scanning the valley below, with binoculars that glinted in the harsh sun. I stumbled into the open and waved my arms above my head, shouting with what little voice I had left. My voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but movement was enough. They'd seen me. When the rescuers finally reached me, descending carefully into the valley and picking their way through the ruins, I was barely conscious. My body had given nearly everything it had to the simple act of survival, and now that rescue was here, it was ready to shut down completely. The men who pulled me from the ruins were professional and efficient, administering immediate medical care and preparing me for transport to the nearest hospital, with the calm competence of people who'd done this before. As they loaded me into their vehicle, I took one last look at Karroun Hill, the place that had nearly killed me, but had also taught me the true meaning of human endurance. The ancient pump sat silent in the valley below, its work finally done after decades of faithful service. Somewhere higher up the slope, a hidden pool reflected the afternoon sky like a mirror, holding secrets the hill would never tell. 3 months later, I sat on the veranda of my suburban Brisbane home, watching the sprinkler system methodically water my lawn. The automatic timer clicked on every evening at 6:30, sending precise arcs of water across the green grass, more water wasted in a single hour than I'd seen in 12 days near Karroun Hill. I'd developed an odd fascination with watching it, this casual abundance that most people took for granted. Sarah had noticed me sitting there each evening, and she'd stopped asking if I was okay. We both knew the answer was more complicated than yes or no. The physical recovery had been straightforward, if not exactly quick. 3 days in hospital for rehydration and treatment of severe sunburn that had left my skin peeling like old paint. Another week of medical leave to regain the weight I'd lost, eating carefully prepared meals that tasted like ambrosia after days of rationing energy bars. My body had bounced back with the resilience of someone accustomed to outdoor work and hiking. The doctors had been impressed with how well I'd managed my water intake during those final days. My discovery of the mining camp and the pump had probably saved my life. They'd used words like remarkable and fortunate, as if my survival had been a stroke of good luck rather than 12 days of grinding determination. But I knew the real recovery was happening somewhere deeper, in places that couldn't be treated with IV drips and electrolyte solutions. The nightmares had been the first sign that Karroun Hill wasn't finished with me yet. Not the dramatic, screaming awake kind of nightmares that movies portrayed, but something more insidious. Dreams where I was perpetually searching for water that was always just out of reach, always one more ridge to climb before finding relief. I'd wake up with my mouth dry and my heart racing, immediately reaching for the glass of water I now kept permanently on my bedside table like a talisman against thirst. Then there were the sounds that followed me home from the desert. In the quiet moments of suburbia, between the hum of air conditioning and the distant traffic on the highway, I would hear echoes of Karroun Hill calling across the kilometers. The settling of the house at night became the creak of the old mining equipment. Wind through the trees transformed into the whisper I'd heard moving across stone and scrubland for 12 endless days. Rational thought told me these were just manifestations of trauma, my brain processing an extreme experience by finding familiar patterns in everyday noise. But late at night, when sleep was elusive and the darkness pressed against my windows like a living thing, I sometimes wondered if part of me was still out there, still listening to the hill's ancient secrets. The lights had never been explained, and I'd stopped trying to explain them to others after seeing the carefully neutral expressions on people's faces. I'd mentioned them to the rescue team, describing the strange illumination I'd witnessed during my worst nights on the hill. The lead rescuer, a weathered man named Doug who'd been pulling people out of the Outback for 20 years, had nodded with the understanding of someone who'd heard similar stories before. "Lot of folks see things out there," he'd said, checking his equipment with practiced efficiency. Could be mining equipment, old machinery catching moonlight, could be atmospheric pressure, heat mirages at night, could be your brain trying to make sense of being alone too long. The unspoken fourth option, that it could be something unexplained, something that belonged to the landscape in ways science couldn't measure, hung in the air between us. Doug had seen enough of the Outback to know that some experiences couldn't be filed neatly into categories of hallucination or rational explanation. My relationship with hiking had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The obvious part was the gear. I now carried enough emergency equipment to outfit a small expedition. Satellite communicator with backup battery, water purification tablets, emergency shelter, enough high-calorie food for twice my planned duration. My backpack had gained 10 pounds of safety equipment, and I'd accepted that as a necessary trade-off for peace of mind. Sarah had insisted on most of the additions, and I hadn't argued. The memory of my phone showing no signal bars for days on end was enough to justify any amount of extra weight. But the subtle changes ran deeper than equipment lists. I found myself drawn to water sources with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I'd always been a capable hiker, someone who planned his routes and carried adequate supplies. Now I researched every creek, every bore, every possible water source along my intended path with the thoroughness of a military operation. I'd stand at stream crossings and drink more than I needed, filling bottles and reservoirs beyond reasonable capacity. The logical part of my mind knew this was overcorrection, but the deeper part, the part that remembered scraping dew from rocks with desperate fingers, insisted on the extra margin of safety. Emma had grown in the months since my return, her vocabulary expanding to include new questions about Daddy's adventure in the desert. She would sit on my lap in the evenings and trace the route on my maps with her small finger, asking why I'd gotten lost and whether the rocks were scary. Her questions were innocent but cut straight to the heart of things I was still trying to understand myself. "Were you afraid, Daddy?" she asked one evening, her brown eyes serious in a way that made her seem older than her 3 years. "Yes, sweetheart, I was very afraid. But you came home." "Yes, I came home." She seemed satisfied with this explanation in the way that children can be, accepting that adults sometimes faced scary things and survived them through mechanisms beyond her understanding. But I knew that as she grew older, her questions would become more complex, more demanding of answers I wasn't sure I possessed. The anniversary of my rescue had passed the previous week, marked by a brief mention in the local newspaper that had picked up the story months earlier. "Local man celebrates year since Outback survival ordeal," the headline read, above a photo of me standing in my backyard with my expanded collection of emergency gear. The reporter had asked about my plans for future hiking, whether the experience had put me off the Outback permanently. I'd given the expected answers about respecting the environment and being better prepared, but the real truth was more complicated. The Outback hadn't become my enemy during those 12 days. If anything, I felt a deeper connection to it now. The raw honesty of a landscape that could kill you through simple indifference had stripped away pretense and revealed something essential about both the country and myself. Karroun Hill had been a harsh teacher, but I couldn't bring myself to hate it any more than I could hate the ocean for being deep or fire for being hot. It was simply what it was, operating by rules that predated human civilization by millions of years. What had changed was my understanding of my place within that vastness. Before Karroun Hill, I'd approached the Outback with the casual confidence of someone who'd grown up with it, who understood its moods and seasons well enough to feel at home among its challenges. I'd seen myself as competent, experienced, someone who belonged in wild places. The experience of being lost had revealed the thin veneer of that confidence, showing me how quickly competence could give way to desperation, how narrow the margin was between being a capable hiker and becoming another cautionary tale told around campfires. As the sprinkler system clicked off, and evening settled over my suburban street, I reflected on how the experience had redefined my relationship with ordinary abundance. The water flowing endlessly from taps, the refrigerator humming reliably in my kitchen, the electric lights that banished darkness at the flip of a switch. These weren't just conveniences anymore, but daily miracles that most people never paused to consider. Karroun Hill had taken 12 days from my life, but it had given me something in return, a deeper understanding of resilience, both my own and humanity's in general. Every person walking the streets of Brisbane was a survival story, stretching back through countless generations, each one descended from ancestors who'd faced their own version of running out of water in impossible places. I'd simply been reminded of that fundamental truth in a more direct way than most people ever experience. The hill itself remained unchanged, still rising from the Queensland landscape like a sleeping giant, still harboring its old mining camps and hidden pools. Other hikers would venture into its shadow, and most would emerge with nothing more dramatic than tired feet and good memories. But occasionally someone would make a wrong turn or misjudge the distance to the next water source, and Karroun Hill would present them with the same ancient test it had given me. How badly do you want to keep living, and what are you willing to endure to see another sunrise? As I stood up from my chair and headed inside for dinner, I carried with me the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd been asked that question and found an answer. The hill had marked me, changed me in ways both visible and hidden, but I'd proven something to myself in those 12 days that no amount of ordinary success could have taught me. When everything familiar was stripped away and survival came down to the most basic elements of human determination, I'd found reserves of strength I hadn't known existed. That knowledge would stay with me for the rest of my life, a gift wrapped in the harsh landscape of Karroun Hill, paid for with 12 days of fear and thirst, and the sound of an old pump coughing water from the ground, just when hope seemed lost. If you've ever found yourself truly lost, miles from help, with darkness falling, you know the silence I'm talking about. It's different from any quiet you've experienced before, deeper, more absolute, filled with the weight of your own mortality. Hit like and subscribe for more stories from the edge of nowhere, because the Outback's got plenty more lessons to teach, and I'll be here to tell them.